But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we explore the life of Galileo, the father of modern science. Born in Pisa in 1564, Galileo revolutionized our understanding of the universe with groundbreaking discoveries from Jupiter's moons to the phases of Venus. His use of the telescope challenged century-old beliefs, while his defiance of authority during the Inquisition cemented his legacy as a symbol of scientific courage. Join us as we uncover the story of a man who reshaped the way we see the cosmos and inspired generations to seek the truth. This is the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where we are staying in Italy and staying in the Renaissance and staying very scientific once again. And we're moving forward about 100 years and looking at Galileo Galilei. He goes by Galileo, and when you have one name and that's the name that you go by, it means you probably did something right. And he really needs no introduction again. We've done Da Vinci last time. We talked about he needs no introduction, and Galileo in a little bit of a different way, more on the scientific side, but definitely a household name, definitely someone who has changed the world for the better. But also he had his challenges, and when we look at science versus religion as almost as a battleground in the ideological sense, this is kind of, I think, the first real big pure battle between science and religion that we can look back on in history. And I think that's what makes this conversation so interesting, because he's not only a smart and brilliant guy, but he really kind of sees this world that's changing, and he's trying to make some changes. The church is trying to keep things the way they want things, and inevitably that clash is going to happen.
Yeah, I think you summed it up really well. One of the things that really comes out to me in this episode and with the research and just with Galileo in general is this, what is knowledge? How do we actually quantify it, understand it, and, potentially start to question it? And I think at the core of this episode is this contention between, what's understood as knowledge until someone like Galileo comes along and questions orthodox thinking to say, maybe we've been wrong about this, but to contest a widely held belief across the modern world at this time is no easy lift. And I think it is contentious, and he does pay for it, as we'll get into it later in the episode. But to me, that's probably one of the cooler things about, this discussion we're going to have today.
I think that's so interesting how it's this challenge of knowledge and trying to do something different. But what I also see is it's the foundation of science as the way we know it today. Because I think up to this point, science had kind of been like pseudo philosophy in some capacity, where you'd have like observations, but then you'd also have this philosophical element to it. If you go back to the ancient Greeks and all the things that they would talk about, it always was based in some sort of philosophical element to it. And you see some mathematics and some kind of pure science come in, where when you look at someone like Galileo, there really isn't any of that philosophical element to it. It's just pure observation, pure science at this point. And I think that's a bit of a change for the world, because we saw Da Vinci start with those, doing a little bit of mathematics, bringing in his artistic skills, but wouldn't say he was a true scientist in the way we would see a scientist today. Galileo is absolutely a true scientist, and he understands the mathematics. He's going through the scientific method and kind of refining it as it goes. But I think that's a big change for the church, especially, and people at large, where every finding and everything that had come up before this always had an opinionated element to it. Not to say science isn't opinionated, but it was always had, this is kind of the way I'm interpreting things. But now it's going into, hey, look, I have hard evidence. And I don't really have an opinion, but this is just what the evidence is telling me. And it's difficult, I think, for especially the church to kind of see the difference between the two, because they sometimes see it as a challenging of authority and almost as a threat in that sense. But someone like Galileo is seeing it as, well, this is just what I've seen. This is what I've measured. So what more do you want from me?
Yeah, I think that's such a fascinating and almost the entertaining perspective of this conversation in many ways, right? Is as you'll see throughout this discussion, the scientific method really starts to take shape. It is about, the observation. It's about measurement. It's about repeatable processes and steps to be able to actually validate your experiment, really touching on the episodes that we had on Leonardo. But I think with Galileo, we see it with much more rigor and structure.
Definitely. It's not as much of, almost, Leonardo walking out in the woods and just drawing stuff and being really interested and curious. It's more of, state your hypothesis, test it out, see what the results tell you, and then continually refine until you're looking for the result that you're looking for, or it's been proved wrong in some way, or your answer's inconclusive and you move on to the next thing. But it does start with that insane level of curiosity and the ability to observe and understand your observations to make those conclusions. And Galileo really takes what Da Vinci started and other people around this time and really kind of, I would say, refines it and puts it into maybe a little more of a tighter box where we can say, this is science versus this is science plus philosophy plus some artistic elements to it. It's a little bit more, I think, refined.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfectly summed up. So I think we could probably get into the bio and start talking about his early life and how he's able to accomplish the things that he does. So he's born in February 15th, 1564 in Pisa, which is in Tuscany. And obviously it has the famous Leaning Towers, but it also has a centuries-old university tradition. It's a vibrant intellectual and cultural hub at the time, and it's flourishing under the governance of the Medici family, who, if you've listened to us for any period of time, they have been kind of mainstays across many of our episodes related to the Renaissance. They are patrons of the arts and sciences, and they kind of help shape this era and making it an environment ripe for scholarly growth and innovation.
And I think it's interesting now that you mentioned Pisa and the Medici. We talked about last week where Machiavelli wanted to turn it, basically redirect the Arno River away from Pisa because they were always at war with Florence. And I think a lot's happened in this time. And it's interesting when we look at Florence, it's still the Florence that, we kind of know and love. But we always talked about, when we talk about Lorenzo and the Medici and this, de facto ruler of the Republic of Florence. They've got rid of that Republic and de facto nonsense, and they've just become the Dukes of Tuscany. And so I think it's really more established now that the Medici are in charge, and it's not going through this pseudo democratic process. It's really kind of been hammered home, but now it's grown outside of Florence, right? And so I think it's important for someone like Galileo, is being born into Pisa. He's already interconnected now with the network of Florence and the greater Tuscan area, versus maybe before where you would be, hey, you're part of Pisa and you're an independent state, and that's kind of where you're gonna be, and you're not necessarily going to be welcomed in a city like Florence, or you're not going to necessarily be able to go to a city like Milan because of all the things that are going on. I think now he's got a little bit more of a free network he can travel in, which is going to be really key for someone like him, who's part of this network of these young scientists, growing and trying to really bring ideas off each other and make some discoveries.
Yeah, and I think that actually segues quite well into the next point, just around his family. And I think his father, in many ways, is actually able to leverage this network too. So Galileo was the eldest of 6 or 7 children. Historical accounts are kind of gray there, but 6 or 7 children. His father, this is actually pretty interesting. His name is Vincenzo. He was a noted lutenist, which is a musical instrument, and a music theorist who conducted experiments on musical strings to understand harmonics. This experimental approach to art and science that we're already seeing, even though it was focused on music, I would assume would indirectly influence Galileo's later empirical learnings. You could see that his father was, willing to challenge established musical theory for the sake of experimentation. And, he kind of hinted at a spirit of inquiry that Galileo, that we'll see that he would adopt and develop more fully into the realm of natural philosophy. And I think it's interesting. We've had a couple of these episodes where the apple does not fall far from the tree in many respects when you have someone like this that's, in your immediate circle, especially if it's a parent or caregiver that kind of nurtures this, questioning, critical thinking, education. It really does do a lot, to shape the mind, I imagine, of young Galileo in this perspective.
So Renaissance. So as you were speaking of, hey, there's a musician who really wants to know more about music. So he starts running experiments on harmonics and trying to learn. And it's like, yeah, we talked about Da Vinci doing that all the time. He wanted to be a better painter. So he learned about the human body, and, seeing Galileo's father, do kind of the same sort of thing. And then how can it not rub off? He's seeing that from his father. He's seeing it probably on a daily basis with different people doing different things. But I love that part of the Renaissance so much, is you have that artistic side and that experimentation, curiosity side that leads into, more of the hard sciences at some point. And you just have that crossover. And I think it's a great way because it's, these people trying to learn a little bit more about their craft, but kind of taking a more scientific approach to it. And it's a natural segue for someone like Galileo to, like we talked about, really put science into a box. And, there's no way that that's not rubbing off on him at a very young age.
Yeah. And that's just his home life, right? And then a little bit later, his family moves to Florence when Galileo is still a child. So now he's living in the cultural capital of the Renaissance. He's growing up amidst, a milieu of the revival of classical learning, the pursuit of new knowledge. He's surrounded by artistic and architectural masterpieces, philosophical discussions that animated the city's academies and intellectual circles. Although the family's not wealthy, the Galilei family was a part of a well-educated kind of middle-class professional stratum. And his parents understood the importance of education, set him on a path they hoped would bring prestige and financial stability to himself and the family. And as a youth, he received that pretty foundational humanistic education, which included Latin, Greek, logic, literature. It is pretty standard for any young gentleman with scholarly ambitions in Renaissance Italy, because this background provided him with a very strong grounding in classical texts, rhetorical skills, and obviously this would serve him well in any, occupation, but specifically in articulating his scientific arguments that he would form much later in life.
Yeah, it's interesting about, I'm thinking back to Leonardo and him not having this classical education and kind of learning by doing and experimenting. But, as time has gone on here, the education system, I'm sure, is reformed in some way. But again, being able to get into a world where he can connect with his fellow scientists and be trained in that sense for the type of work that he's going to end up doing, I think is so important. So again, very fortunate that he's able to go through, this path, learning Latin, learning how to speak and share his ideas. And we'll get into a little bit around Galileo being actually a really good speaker and really good at sharing his knowledge. And I think that's kind of what makes him so famous, is his ability to share. And it's a lot of things we see with scientists that we've studied is some are really great lecturers and really strong at their work, but when it comes to talking to the masses, forget about it. So I think that'll be interesting as we go along. But I think it's always fascinating to see that he moves to this new city, he's learning in this kind of more traditional sense, but he's able to bring a little bit of that, I guess you would say, maybe upper class kind of snobby scientist elements to it, and be able to just kind of be more of a man of the people as time goes on. So I'm just finding that interesting as he's kind of going down this path.
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on something with Leonardo that I think we'll see that Galileo may have a bit of Leonardo in him. And that's because at the age of 17, he does enroll at the University of Pisa to study medicine, partly driven by family wishes, as becoming a physician is, pretty reputable and it's a potentially very lucrative career as it is today. But Galileo's heart did not lie in the study of medicine. Instead, he found himself drawn to mathematics, natural philosophy, subjects that ignited his curiosity in understanding the workings of the natural world through a more rigorous, quantifiable lens. And here's a turning point, which I think is so fascinating. So while at the University of Pisa, he's attending a lecture on geometry by Ostilio Ricci. He's a mathematician who's closely associated with the Florentine court and its tradition of practical mathematics. Unlike the abstract and philosophical approach of scholastic thinkers, Ricci's teachings demonstrate the power of mathematics as a tool for solving real-world problems, particularly in engineering and mechanics. This encounter proved transformative. It's kind of the trigger for Galileo realizing that mathematics could serve as a precise language for describing and understanding physical phenomena. And I think this epiphany marked a decisive break with traditional scholastic philosophy for him, because, the traditional philosophy emphasized adherence to Aristotle and other classical authorities, but Galileo saw that nature could be measured, quantified, and reasoned about deductively, a radically different approach for his time. And I think motivated by this realization, he actually abandoned his medical studies and left the University of Pisa in 1585 without completing his degree. You might think this is a bit of a failure, but I think this unconventional choice revealed a growing independence of thought, and what we'll see is a hallmark of his intellectual life.
It's really again, you mentioned it's a big change. Just as you were talking, I just kept thinking I think it just hit me now for the first time, how big of a change that is. Like you said, Aristotle is still the governing authority from 2000 or 1500 to 2000 years ago, and maybe more than that. And so it's this level of, like I was saying earlier, of this philosophy and science kind of mixing and this opinionated element to it, and almost having to have this really strong level of rhetoric where you're able to share but also persuade a little bit with your ideas and kind of make it make sense. Where Galileo's kind of, seeing this where, wait a second, I can put numbers to something and it really doesn't matter how someone's opinion is. I can put something right on paper and say, yes, this is the answer. And we can have like an absolute truth, which is like a whole nother kind of philosophical question. And I can see why that's so attractive to somebody like him, especially with all the levels of curiosity. And, I'm sure he's thinking about his father, trying to learn about, harmonics and, can we put measurements to these sort of things, and just being able to observe the world in the way that he does. And I can see why, like, when he looks at, his medical career at that time, right, they don't have the instrumentation to measure things on the level that they would need to for medicine. But when you come to, larger objects, planets, moons, stars, things are, he's maybe not thinking about it right at that moment, but I think at that time period, you can definitely see that, yeah, if you're going to want to measure things with some hard math, this is the direction you're going to go. And it totally makes sense why he kind of looked at, being a physician and walked away, especially because I'm sure he's being trained too more as almost, here's how you do things versus let's learn something new and try to figure it out.
Yeah, I think it's so thematic of the Renaissance too, right? And it's come up in almost every episode that has touched on the Renaissance. And to his credit, he's undeterred and he pursues a very self-directed education, mathematics, and natural philosophy. He starts studying the works of Archimedes, Elucid, and he's still cultivating relationships with the scholars who kind of further fueled his curiosity. Again, those patronage networks, those academic networks are still very much there as something that he can leverage. And despite lacking a formal degree, his brilliance to his counterparts is very obvious, especially his dedication to mathematics quickly becomes very evident to those around him. Then he actually is able to support himself through private tutoring, and he kind of hones his teaching ability and begins building a reputation. So I think we're already seeing elements of that, oratory or communication skills. And this growing recognition leads him to secure a position as a mathematics instructor in Florence without a degree. I just want to double underline that because I think that's really cool. And this is a city, again, that's renowned for its artistic and scientific vitality during the Renaissance. Again, it's like that fertile environment for Galileo, who can draw inspiration from all of those around him to continue fueling his work.
Yeah, you're just starting to see this isn't just some guy from Pisa who likes math. He's another rock star and another superstar of this time period. Like you said, to be able to teach without having a degree, and especially in a world where tradition and kind of going through the right path is definitely very key. But, this is something new and exciting, and he's at the level of, oh yeah, there's something real here. He's able to come into these places and, speak and teach and do all the things that he needs to do to get to a point where, yeah, people are looking at him in some different ways and saying, yeah, I want to be on the ground floor and I want to work with Galileo and I want to give him the opportunity. So yeah, I think he's not only in the right spot, but I think he's already made a name for himself at such a young age. Maybe not, on the grander scale amongst the public, but definitely amongst the intellectual circles.
Exactly. And I think building that foundation for him at this point in his life is so essential. So after a couple of years of doing this in Florence, he returns to Pisa and he returns as a lecturer in mathematics. And during this period, he starts to begin actually developing the ideas that would underpin his contributions to physics. He starts conducting some very early investigations into the mechanics of motion, including studies of pendulums, falling objects, inclined planes, and experiments that reflected his very systematic observational approach to understand natural phenomenon.
I think the most disappointing part of all this, and from my research, is I always heard that he dropped things from the Leaning Tower of Pisa to see how fast they fell. But unfortunately, that's not true, because for obvious reasons, you can't have some guy dropping things off this huge tower with people walking underneath. So that's unfortunate, but yeah, like you just mentioned a whole bunch of things, and it's not like, he's just thinking about them. These are like fundamental things in physics and fundamental laws of motion that when Sir Isaac Newton comes along, for example, he's going to, put into his laws of motion, and everything kind of goes back to Galileo. And I think I have a perfect example of something that he figured out. So we know today that when you drop two objects, if they have the same, so regardless of their weight or their mass, they're going to drop relative to how much air resistance that they have. And so basically Aristotle and all the Greek philosophers basically said, yeah, the heavier object will fall faster. And Galileo, like we said, he's challenging these things. But ultimately, it's not something you can measure easily. You can't suck the air out of a room in this time and try to measure it. So, smaller scale. And he's he's able to figure this out. But I think the coolest thing is we have to fast forward many, many years to 1971 and the Apollo 15 mission. So Commander Dave Scott is famous for being on the moon, and he goes up there and he brings a feather and a hammer, and he's looking into the camera and he basically says, I have a feather in my left hand or a hammer in my right hand. And he goes, well, one of the reasons that we actually made it here today was because of some work Galileo did a long time ago. And, he made some really great discoveries when it came to falling objects and gravity. And so he goes, what would be a better time or a better place to actually test out one of his fundamental theories? And so he has the hammer and the feather in front of him. He drops them. And since there's no air on the moon, they both drop and at the exact same rate. And he goes, hey, look at that. Turns out Mr. Galileo was correct. And he goes, isn't this a fun way to prove it? So I think that's just, for someone like Galileo, right, for all the things that he's going to end up going through, to have his things tested on the moon on television and actually be proven, when it comes to legacy and things like that, I think that's just so cool because it goes to show that, this isn't just some thing that he's figured out. Not only is it a fundamental force that actually helps astronauts get to the moon, but they're actually thinking about his fundamental principles so much that they actually wanted to run, you don't have time to run a lot of tests when you're on the moon. They actually decided to do one of Galileo's. I think that's pretty awesome.
That's such a great story. And I think it's important, not just for the entertainment value, but because there's an element there that I think kind of underpins this conversation. And I touched on at the beginning is this whole idea around like epistemology and what is knowledge and what do we actually understand and what's validated. That gap is 350 years between his theorizing and that story with Captain Dave Scott, more or less. So if you take it back to Galileo's time, at this point, he's a mathematics lecturer at the University of Pisa in 1589. And it's during this tenure that he begins to systematically challenge Aristotelian physics. And again, this is like, I can't even think of an example of what this would be like challenging in the modern day.
Well, it's thousands of years of just, this is the way things work. And the reason the Renaissance becomes the Renaissance is because we're studying the ancients, and look how great everything has been because we studied the ancients. And now you want to challenge this wisdom, you want to challenge that knowledge. There is nothing like it. And I can see why you're struggling because there's nothing I can think of that has been not just like one or 2 points of, hey, we thought this for thousands of years and, now we think something else. It's not like, oh, we didn't know about germs and then we figured out germs. It was a whole basis of thinking and just, this is the way the world works. And we've thought about it like that for thousands of years. And you want to challenge that whole thing. There really isn't anything I think that comes close to that.
Yeah, I think that's just grand scale of what he's actually trying to challenge at this point in time. And, his challenges to this orthodoxy, however, as anyone can imagine, including our listeners, did not sit well with Pisa's conservative academic environment. He's kind of outspoken and his methods are kind of unconventional. Those stories about him dropping balls of different weights from the leaning tower, it's just not conventional in this era. But because he's kind of getting alienated at this point, he moves to the University of Padua, which is kind of known for being a more progressive institution, renowned for more intellectual openness. And Padua kind of provides Galileo with the freedom to teach, research, and collaborate with like-minded scholars. And over the next, I think it's 15 to 18 years, 1592 to 1610, he thrives here, teaching geometry, mechanics, astronomy, while conducting, systematic experiments that laid the groundwork for his revolutionary discoveries. And this is where a lot of his, mechanical inventions and the foundations in physics that we still use today really start to take shape and form.
Yeah, I think this is just, again, we talked about Da Vinci last time. He's finding the right place for him where he can thrive and do some of the things that he needs to. And he's got the talent, so he just needs to be able to do what he needs to do. But you're right, he's got a little bit of that. I almost think of like Oppenheimer, a little bit of that, a little bit of an awkward scientist. He's going to speak his mind, maybe social norms. He's not fully understanding, and he's, pushing people in the wrong way and is just so disagreeable with everything that he does, which makes him such a great scientist because he's willing to challenge everything. But you can already start to see, right, he's hopping around to a lot of universities here, and he's probably annoyed a lot of people along the way. But I think what's something that was interesting as I was going through all the different things that he discovered or tried to discover was you'd find some things where he would try and fail and just kind of went, all right, and maybe had some theories about it, but didn't really have this like obsessiveness about it. So an example that I read was him and some of his colleagues were really curious to try to measure the speed of light. They had a theory that light can't be instantaneous. It has to move like everything else in the world. And so they actually created an experiment where they had some pretty accurate I guess, time capture. I'm not sure exactly what they're using to capture time at this point, but they were basically pretty far away from each other, and they had these big lanterns with shutters, and they were opening and closing them, and basically trying to measure, okay, you opened and closed it at this time, and I saw it at this time. And basically they got to the point where they're like, it kind of seems instantaneous, but they kind of chalked it up to, yeah, this is not something we're going to be able to measure. Maybe it is instantaneous, we're not sure, but we're going to move on and do something else. But the fact that they're interested and they're going for it, and not, Galileo's not running around with trying to prove his theory right, and being really obsessive over that. He's trying a whole bunch of different things. And I think it ultimately comes down for him is the math and the observations are what's telling the story for him. And we'll see how that really goes from just, he's doing things kind of on a small scale and running the mathematics. But, as he starts to look up in the air and looking into the stars, into the heavens, he's seeing these observations in certain ways, but then bringing his mathematical skills into play as well. So I think it's just interesting to kind of paint that picture of Galileo as, yeah, he's definitely stubborn. He's definitely someone who likes to challenge the status quo and maybe doesn't understand when he should stop. But when it comes to pure science, he's definitely not maybe a fanatic in the sense where he's running down rabbit holes trying to prove, these crazy theories. He's still pretty grounded in observation and his math is telling him.
Yeah, I think even not more importantly, but as importantly, is that just because he can't measure it, he's not giving space for some divine answer in the 1500s, which I think is also very remarkable of a break. And he is a religious man, right? So I think there's a very interesting kind of interplay of religion, even at the individual level. I know we're going to get into it more socially and culturally, like across what it means for this part of the world at this time. But even to run these experiments, but accept the limits of their methodology and observation skills, and not necessarily quantify it as some, divine intervention that makes light move instantaneously, but just say, we'll move on to something else is again, quite unconventional. And I think it really does set him apart in many ways from his contemporaries.
Absolutely. And I think they've come in, part of it, I think, is because the church is kind of accepting it a little bit at this point, but they've come in with this, hey, we're religious. We believe in God. God has created this beautiful world and universe for us. And now he's given us the opportunity to learn what he's done and measure things. Like, what a great opportunity. And for the church, right, they're like, of course we want to learn about all the great things that God's created for us. But I think maybe it's a good time to just maybe get into a little bit of that on, what is the church's stance on science? And I think this is probably the most interesting part of all this research for me. I came into this as Galileo representing science in this corner, the Pope and the church in this corner, and it's just, a battle, and one is going to win out and they can't coexist. And that can't be farther from the truth. I was really surprised as I was reading on this about what the Catholic Church was really doing from a scientific perspective during the Renaissance. So they funded universities. So the University of Padua, where Galileo is, that's got funding from the church. The University of Bologna, which is one of the oldest universities in the world, has a lot of funding from the church. And the University of Paris as well has funding from the church. And so you're seeing a lot of these things, but they're not necessarily, they didn't call it science at the time. They were pushing a lot of money into studying natural philosophy. So in their eyes, it was, look, if we can understand the natural world, we're revealing the grandeur of God's creation. And really, science and faith were seen as compatible with scientific study enhancing theological knowledge. And that's kind of the way the world that Galileo is in, is there's a coming together of the two, and seems like it's kind of working. And a perfect example of that is the Gregorian calendar. So the calendar we all use today was an example of the church's active engagement with science. So Pope Gregory, he commissioned a few astronomers to basically correct the inaccuracies in the Julian calendar, basically saying, look, tell us what the stars are doing, tell us the way the earth is moving, and we'll actually fix exactly how the calendars are supposed to be with some small changes, which is just pure science at the end of the day. We're measuring these things, but this is coming out of the church. This is a church-funded effort, which I thought was so fascinating. This isn't people banging on the Pope's door saying we need to change the calendar, and the church going, no, it says in the Bible this and this, and we have to do this. The church is like, no, we're going to do this right. And we're going to fund not only universities, but we're going to have actually a really strong scientific and astronomy group within the Vatican itself. And there's, priests and bishops and stuff who are actually studying science and kind of reporting back to the Pope. And it's kind of some stuff being done in-house, which I thought was, to me, again, even crazier just based on kind of how I came into this with. But you're really seeing it's coming together in a way that's really working well, especially with the church having so much money and having a reason to study science. And again, it's the Renaissance. Why wouldn't you be studying things? This is just what happens. So I think it's super fascinating how they're, really coming together, and they're, trying to, basically build on everything that they've been doing. But there's a bit of a line in the sand, and we'll see that of, yes, you can explain the world, but you can't kind of take over for God in any way, really. This is what, God is doing certain things. And then there's also, here's certain things that are kind of, etched in stone and they cannot change. So don't challenge those, potentially the earth being the center of the universe. So there's some different things like that will come into play. But for the most part, there's definitely a really strong synergy, and things seems to be going, I would say, pretty well from, the advancement of science with the church's backing.
Yeah, I think that was my biggest kind of shock and awe moment when doing research, was that churches funding universities and taking on their own, almost creating like a science wing in the Vatican to do their own studies and observations. And I think it's kind of symbolic of a lot of what's going on at the time, right? There's this interplay of intellectual curiosity. It's paired with Catholic authority. There's shifting political dynamics. There's a slow evolution of scientific discovery that we're kind of talking about, but there's also this very deeply entrenched theological worldview within not just, well, I guess it would be the Catholic world, but that kind of extends very broadly when we're speaking about it in this era. And in terms of what actually, leads to this contention, and I think before we get into the telescope, because that's what most people know Galileo for, he is credited for making a number of inventions that I'll just kind of quickly run through. In 1593, he made a thermoscope. As you can probably elicit from that, it's a precursor to the modern thermometer. It was a device that demonstrated temperature change by the expansion and contraction of air, then caused a liquid to rise and fall in the tube. It didn't have a numerical scale, but it allowed him to observe temperature variations. He also created geometric and military compasses for practical mathematics involving geometry, surveying, and military purposes. Its goal was to help artillerymen calculate the trajectory of cannonballs and surveyors to measure distances. What else did he do? Oh, he made a water pump using a siphon, which is really interesting. So he designed a water lifting device using a very simple siphon that could kind of support and help practical water management. Hydrostatic balance. This was a balance designed to measure the density of objects by comparing the weight in water and in air. This was based on Archimedes' principle of buoyancy.
Not bad.
Not bad.
Not bad for a lifetime. Hey, you're doing all these scientific proofs, but you're also not only contributing to the world of engineering, but also to scientific measurements, right? Because that's also a pretty new field. And okay, he's got to do all these experiments. He's like, okay, I got to measure these things to be able to prove it mathematically. How am I going to go do that? And there's a good 4 or 5 examples of him continuously doing that. Again, it's like Da Vinci, right? You just, let's take it for granted, right? It's just add another one to the list because it doesn't stop with these guys.
I also think it's the practical application that's so interesting, right? He's not just like creating stuff for the sake of creating stuff. I know with Da Vinci, he had a bit of a creative side where he would just like to go do things for the sake of doing things. And, he had that kind of artist mind in some respect. But these all have military, administrative, bureaucratic applications that people can use. So I think there's an interesting insight here about that kind of, applied lens of science that we're starting to see. And, the big one that we're talking about, and I know everyone's been itching to hear it, it's the telescope. And this is kind of like the breakthrough moment. So in 1609, Galileo learns of a Dutch invention that used lenses to magnify distant objects. And here's the crazy part. Without ever seeing the device, he constructed his own telescope and steadily improved its magnifying power. His telescope soon surpassed the capabilities of the original Dutch model, achieving magnifications up to 20 times stronger without ever seeing it.
Yeah, it just goes to show that he's told something's possible, and he's just got such a good understanding of pretty much everything, it seems like, at this point, where he's able to figure this out. And then, again, going through the trial and error and different things that he's trying to be able to figure that out, and then from a result to see something 20 times more in those days, looking up at the sky, he's going to be seeing a whole whack of things, especially he's not dealing with light pollution or anything back then. I can only imagine, the skies that they're seeing, and 20 times, it's going to have some pretty interesting discoveries.
Some very interesting discoveries. Yeah. So when he turns his telescope to the night sky, the sense of awe he's probably met with is giving me goosebumps, but it opens up, a new window into the cosmos. And he has a series of groundbreaking observations, which we've kind of touched on already, but it's going to change the very understanding of where the world fits into the universe. A couple of the things that he observes, he discovered that the rugged cratered surface of the moon, kind of disproving the notion that celestial bodies were perfect and unembellished. The 4 largest moons of Jupiter, demonstrating that not all celestial bodies revolve around the Earth. He observed the phases of Venus, which could only be explained if Venus orbited the sun, providing direct evidence for the Copernican heliocentric model, and sunspots on the solar surface, further challenging the belief in the unchanging perfection of the heavens.
There's so much right there. And I think the fact that proving that the moon, for example, follows similar physical laws that Earth does in terms of things are smashing into it and moving around, and there's craters and mountains and those sort of things. And, you know, seeing things orbiting Jupiter, seeing the Venus going through its phases, and really just saying, okay, this Copernicus guy may have had a point. And I think it's worth mentioning a little bit on what Copernicus actually found and why his ideas were interesting, but not necessarily accepted, partially due to the fact that we didn't have Galileo's telescopes. But really what he basically came up with was that there's this called, the heliocentric model, that the sun is actually the center of the universe, or basically the center of something. They weren't exactly sure yet. And the Earth was orbiting around it and all of the planets. And basically it really went against the established rule that the Earth not only is the center of the universe and everything revolves around the Earth, but also that the Earth isn't moving through space. It's a stationary object where everything is moving around the Earth. And so came out with this idea. And the thing was, scientists even were skeptical because it didn't have the observational proof. And we see this a lot in science where we have these great theories, but somebody needs to come along on the experimental side and actually prove it. So scientists were a little, kind of iffy on it. The church was definitely pushing back on it. And then the calculations that Copernicus did, there were still some anomalies in it. And some astronauts not astronauts, we're jumping a little bit too far ahead there. Astronomers, they found that his model was mathematically cumbersome, and it didn't fully click with everybody, but it was such an interesting idea and a lot of people were really excited about it. Most interesting thing about all this is the church didn't really take an official stance against Copernicus, because Copernicus actually dedicated the work to Pope Paul III, and the church regarded it, hey, this is useful. We could use it as something to test and look at things. And the church said, yeah, this is more of a mathematical hypothesis, and it's actually good for helping us understand the universe a little bit and measure things, but it's more of a hypothesis, and it's just it's not a literal description of what's happening in the universe and in the heavens, but we think it's useful, and we're gonna not go crazy about this, and we're gonna say that it's okay. And I think this is really important to remember, that the church was kind of okay with this. They didn't initially push back. Where he actually did get some pushback was from the non-Catholics. So Martin Luther, for example, remarked that Copernicus was trying to, quote, turn the whole of astronomy upside down, citing the biblical account of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still. So again, you're seeing pure religious kind of people looking at the Bible and saying, well, the Bible says this, that doesn't meet what your observations are. But the Catholic Church is kind of being like, yeah, it's okay. It's not, we're not going to say that it's true, but we're going to say that it's useful. And I think that's the important part of all of this. But this is a model that's been around, and people are thinking, hey, there might be something to this. But I think the most important part here is Galileo's got the experimentation device that he needs. He's got his 20 to 30 times magnification telescope, and he's able to not only directly see things for himself, but he's able to show other people and really have that, pure empirical evidence to really show that, Copernicus was probably right. And there's a lot more we can do with what he, started out on.
It's interesting. Yeah. So he actually in 1610 publishes a book, Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, which is a very lucid and accessible account of his findings. This kind of, this work causes an immediate sensation, as you can imagine. And it, an overnight transformation of Galileo into a scientific celebrity secures him a prestigious court appointment with the Medici family in Florence. Position kind of frees him up from, his teaching duties and allows him to focus on more research and further solidify his role as this kind of pioneer of observational astronomy.
And I believe he also wrote his work in Italian as well, so everybody could read it, which I think is huge, right, for that time of this wasn't just constrained to the intellectual class that was learning Latin and the educated class. This was something that anybody could read and be interested in. And, what better way to, really become a superstar than not only just to your, people in your corner, but, to have it to everybody. But again, more people reading it, you're going to get a little bit more pushback, but at the same time, you might get some support as well. And, we're also seeing in Germany as well, Kepler is starting to take some of these observations. He's doing a lot of work himself, establishing laws of elliptical orbits, which is a big thing. And, him and Galileo are kind of learning off each other as well. So I think it's part of it too, is, the ability for knowledge to be transferred at such a high rate. And, someone in Italy and someone in Germany corresponding about, these groundbreaking discoveries, I think is so huge. But yeah, he's a superstar now. Not, people probably knew he was going to do something special, but to be able to have that empirical evidence for something that's been sitting there and mostly just in theory for, 50 to 100 years, like, that's going to be a big deal, no matter what.
A very big deal. And as soon as I got to this point in my research, the immediate question that popped to mind was, okay, when is the church coming for him? And I think you've kind of touched on that. And I think it's a really good representation of the church kind of not being this, monolithic enterprise that hates science, want to suppress knowledge. But there is that red line, right? There is a line you do not cross before you're labeled a heretic. But I think for Galileo, the transition from, let's say, celebrated scholar to censored heretic doesn't really seem immediate or inevitable to me so far in the story. But I think it arises from that complexity that we touched on earlier about, that kind of intellectual environment that he's, coming of age in, Roman Catholic authority, those political dynamics that are at play. And again, that slow contention of how science is evolving and how theological thought is also trying to contend with science as well.
Yeah. And I think too, the Catholic Church is starting to lose its grip a little bit on Europe. And we have the Protestant Reformation. We have Martin Luther pushing back against the Catholic Church as well. And I think the church is, not only are they, a little bit maybe stuck in their ways on certain things, but they're seeing threats. And now if the church continues to fracture in certain ways, their grip is going to become lesser. And so you're seeing things like I mentioned, the Reformation, especially on the Protestant side. But on top of that, you're seeing the church, we've have inquisitions going on, there's forbidden books, and there's still definitely a censorship side to everything that's happening. And so the church it's a little, I don't know if scared is the right word, but they're thinking about this and they're saying, okay, we might need to kind of buckle down and say these are the core teachings of the church and that can't change. And we might have to fight back when necessary, because too many people are kind of bending the rules and kind of doing their own thing. And, when we look at Europe and where it goes from the Protestant versus Catholic kind of battles, essentially that happen, it really is the key, I would say, dividing line between Europe for the next few hundred years. So they're not, they're not wrong in saying this is a problem that things are splitting out, especially for someone who wants to keep order, but they're going to start looking at things like what Galileo's published and, maybe kind of not be as open as they once were. But I think to your point, like, when is the church coming? And it's the fact that it's not immediately and it's not for a while, I think, again, just shows that, there's a respect for Galileo. I think they find his work to be interesting and important, especially coming from an Italian who's also, Catholic as well. But at the same time, he hasn't ruffled feathers in a way that's going to get someone to act. But again, the church is not necessarily banging down his door and burning his books and stuff. It's making circulation. People are learning and people seem to enjoy it. And the church seems to be, maybe they don't like it, but they're definitely not, coming down against it. Maybe just indifferent at this point.
Yeah, that's such a great point. So I think in terms of like timing and how this works out, the delay almost is also fascinating in and of itself. So I think he publishes his original findings in 1610. In 1616, his ideas kind of come under formal scrutiny. Again, he hasn't faced any personal condemnation, but the church has declared at this point that heliocentrism is foolish and heretical from both philosophical and theological standpoints. At this point, he has issued a warning to not teach or promote the heliocentric model as a proven fact, though he is permitted to discuss it hypothetically. At the time, he kind of navigates this precarious compromise with care. He's relying on his friendships with the church and his reputation as a respected scholar. But then this very fragile coupling collapses with a publication of a book called The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems in 1632. It's written in Italian for accessibility and framed as a fictional conversation. The dialogue featured three characters: Simplicio, a defender of Aristotelian orthodoxy; Salviati, Galileo's rational spokesperson; and Segredo, a curious, open-minded observer. While it's meant to be a balanced discussion. The dialogue offers a devastating critique of geocentrism and an unmistakable endorsement of the Copernican model. More damaging, however, was the perception that Galileo had insulted Pope Urban, who was once a patron and an ally, by putting his views into Simplicio's mouth, portraying the character as stubborn and unrefined. Whether intentional or not, the timing was obviously catastrophic. The church was already grappling with the political upheaval of the 30 Years' War, and Galileo's dialogue appeared as a challenge to his intellectual dominion during a time of heightened sensitivity, Paul, that you just kind of talked about.
Yeah, and the other thing too is he's friends with Pope Urban. Pope Urban is from Florence. Like, they know each other. Some would say they're friends. I think, like, again, they go to Galileo and say, look, you can't teach it as fact, but I'm sure he's doing lectures and saying, hey, all right, here's what I think, and here's all the evidence. You make up your own mind, wink, wink. And I'm sure that would probably have been enough. But I gotta, like, just reading this, like, what are you thinking, Galileo? I get it. You're probably you've discovered something so important and you want everyone to believe it. And how I mentioned earlier where he seemed to be able to walk away from some things, where here, I guess the observations and all the scientific evidence is so great. I think he just, he can't stand it. But you can't go after the Pope, and you can't make a character that's just this simple-minded guy who can't change his mind and really model it after the Pope. Like, yeah, I just don't know what he's thinking. And I get why he does it, but maybe he thinks his friendship with the Pope will save him and all of those sort of things. But, you have to, read the room, and, it's a very politically turbulent time, and to be able to be doing something like this is, I don't know. I really don't have any reason to say, oh yeah, that made sense. But I think it's just maybe a bit of stubbornness and a bit of, hey, look, I'm right, and I'm going to continue to push that I'm right, and I don't care who thinks it, because, hey, maybe I'm Galileo. I'm a little bit cocky in my ways, and, this is what happens. But church is very powerful. The Pope is very powerful. And, they're not someone that, especially in Italy, someone that you're going to want to have on your bad side.
Well, and that's exactly what happens, right? So I think maybe because of delay in the church actually addressing anything or making any kind of formal statement, maybe he got comfortable. Maybe he felt a little too lackadaisical in, his messaging, and just felt that it was going to be okay. But to your point, so the Pope, who had once been a supporter, he feels personally slighted at this point, and who wouldn't? And this is in an era where religious and political authority essentially go hand in hand. And the dialogue appeared not just as a scientific argument, but as a challenge to the papacy itself. So in their eyes, this is a defiant move by Galileo. Whether it's real or perceived, it doesn't even matter at this point. It's now a matter of power, as if it was, based on doctrine. And this is where Galileo is actually asked to appear before the Inquisition in April 1633. Thankfully, it's housed in very comfortable quarters during the proceedings. The interrogations were not brutal torture sessions, as some later narratives suggest, but they were grueling in their psychological and rhetorical pressure. His defense rested on a careful balancing act. He claimed that he had not violated the 1616 decree because he presented heliocentrism as a hypothesis rather than a fact. He further insisted that dialogue was a work of speculation and that any perceived bias towards Copernicanism was unintentional.
Yeah, I'd like to be the judge on that one, being like, yeah, nice try. But we know what you're doing. But you're probably right, though. He definitely got comfortable. He thought, I can probably get away with this. And, hey, if I don't say it, explicitly as fact, but yeah, he missed the bigger picture, I think. And, again, he's someone who's clearly very respected. So, throwing him into a dungeon and torturing him, I think he has enough backers who would have said, okay, that's a little ridiculous. But at the end of the day, it's tough to defend, you can't go after the Pope. I think that's still the biggest thing is this is someone who, and it's not just some guy. It's one of the most powerful people in Europe, and you can't be sliding him off in that way and making him kind of look to be, almost as a buffoon or a fool. And, no matter how you frame it, it's not going to go over well. And, despite the fact they're going to go through legal proceedings, in that sense and say, hey, you were in violation of this doctrine, even if he was or he wasn't, there's a line and you probably crossed it. And, it's tough, I think, no matter what type of defense he's going to have here, I think it's more of a formality at this point.
Yeah, you nailed it. surprisingly, they were unconvinced. They possessed documents that indicated Galileo had been warned not to advocate for heliocentrism at all, even hypothetically. And whether this interpretation of the injunction was, fair or a product of political opportunism, you can debate it. What's certain is that Galileo's attempts to clarify his intention, it essentially falls on deaf ears. And this is after weeks of interrogation. He's presented a choice: recant his views or face severe punishment. And he's an aging scientist at this point, and imprisonment, excommunication, or even worse possibilities loomed as being very real threats. So on June 22nd, 1633, in the Grand Hall of the Convent of Santa Maria, Galileo publicly abjured his support for heliocentrism. Kneeling before the inquisitors, he recited a prepared statement: "With a sincere heart and unfeigned faith, I abjure, curse, and detest the aforesaid errors and heresies, and I swear that in the future I will never again say or assert anything that might bring suspicion upon me."
It's just, again, now you can kind of understand this battle of, science and religion. It's just kind of a sad kind of wrap up for someone like Galileo, but at the same time, I kind of get it. There's more to this story than just, hey, church says science is bad and Galileo's pro-science. And, I think for a lot of people, right, we see him as, someone who's standing up for science, and he does that. But I think, there's just more to it. And I hate to kind of see the way it wraps up, but I kind of understand it. I think it's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think you're totally right in that opinion. And even, the thing is, it doesn't stop there. So while this act of recantation, definitely spared him from imprisonment, possibly death, it did not erase the weight of the church's judgment, which found him vehemently suspect of heresy. And he was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. The dialogue was banned, and his scientific credibility, at least in the eyes of the church, was formally denounced. But there's a really interesting story, and this is one of those historical stories that it's probably not true, but we love sharing them, is that while he is, being sentenced and the judgment is coming down, he whispers in defiance, "Eppur si muove," which means, "and yet it moves." And according to legend, Galileo uttered this phrase under his breath after recanting, which is a subtle affirmation of the Earth's motion and his unbroken scientific conviction. While there's no evidence that he actually said these words during the trial, I think there is a very symbolic power that is kind of captured in this motif and this story, even if it didn't happen, because I think it really just typifies his legacy and the type of person that he was.
Yeah, even if it's true or not, I want to believe it's true because it's cool. But at the same time, you're right. It exemplifies definitely his thought. And, he didn't just actually stop believing this. It's just not his nature. But yeah, I think it's, even if it's under his breath or in his head, he's got his fingers crossed behind his back while he's saying everything, there's no way he actually believes this. And I think he's realized what he's done. He's not a dumb guy by any stretch of the imagination, and understands that this is absolutely serious. And, to save his life and to be able to live a little bit longer, he's got to do what he needs to do. So, but yeah, I like that little piece because I think it just, again, it brings a little bit more to the legend of Galileo and as this almost scientific martyr that a lot of people see him as.
Yeah, in many ways he is. Again, he is sentenced to house arrest, and he's not really the young, vigorous, wildly traveled scholar at this point. The man who once peered through telescopes into the realms of cosmic grandeur is now faced with a future that's confined to four walls of his home. And yet, while his, physical freedom is limited, his intellectual reach is still kind of boundless. And in the final phase of his life, it kind of becomes a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and, the enduring idea of how powerful ideas can be. So following his trial, he begins his seclusion at his villa in Siena, where he's treated with respect and given space to recover. A few months later, he's permitted to return to his own villa near Florence under strict house arrest. But by this time, he's battling with age, infirmity, and the gradual loss of his eyesight. But he's still surrounded by loyal students and his trusted assistants, and he continues to press forward with unwavering determination. Even though he's denied the freedom to explore the heavens openly, he turns his attention to mechanics, motion, and the behavior of materials, channeling his energy into questions that would continue to lay the groundwork for modern physics. And he actually ends up, I think, releasing or publishing two books. So in In 1638, his final masterpiece, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences, was published in the Dutch Republic beyond the reach of the Italian censors. This magnus opus marked the culmination of decades of experimentation, mathematical reasoning, describing the fundamental principles of kinematics, projectile motion, and material strength. And within its pages, he actually revealed the constancy of acceleration in falling objects, parabolic trajectory of projectiles, ideas that, had dismantled Aristotelian physics and shaped the scientific understanding of motion. And it would be Isaac Newton who would later synthesize his findings into the laws of motion and universal gravitation. Famously wrote that he stood on the shoulders of giants, and Galileo was one of these giants who ensured that science would no longer rely on abstract speculation, appeals to authority, but on measured, observable behavior of the natural world.
It just goes to show that, he has a lot of supporters outside of just what the Pope has decided. And there's even some talk that the Pope was kind of a little paranoid with everything that was going on. And it wasn't necessarily, I think everyone agreeing that locking up Galileo was the right thing. But the fact that he's able to still do all the things that he needs to do, get it out of Italy and get it published, he's definitely got support. And again, to hear things like Newton saying, I'm standing on the shoulders of Galileo to do what I needed to do. And, again, we look at going back to where Da Vinci was 100 years ago and looking to where Galileo is, it's such a stark contrast in how quickly things have changed and how these fundamental elements of physics and of science and of material science and engineering are all just coming so quickly, and they're just being spread around Europe. And, the Enlightenment is about to begin, and Europe is about to change in significant ways. And, you can really root it back to someone like Galileo and, not only his ability to do what he did, but the ability, and like we mentioned, I think you mentioned it a few times off the top, is to challenge those ancient philosophers in ways that really never had been done before, and at least to this level, and then to be successful at it, I think it just goes to show where, when you put him in terms of legacy and those sort of things, there's very few comparisons to that, because it's such a stark contrast and such a stark change. And he has to do all that while maneuvering, the Catholic Church almost being just down the road from him. It's just impressive, I think, is the only way I can really describe it.
I think the timing is exceptional, right? So he publishes his last work, his final masterpiece, in 1638. And then in January of 1642, he dies quietly at the age of 77. And he never achieved reconciliation with the church during his lifetime. His influence on science, his influence on science had already grown way too powerful to suppress at this point. And while initially denied a place of honor within the Basilica in Florence, where many of Italy's greatest luminaries are buried, his remains were later moved there in 1737. And today his monumental tomb stands as a tribute to a man who forever changed humanity's relationship with the cosmos.
Not bad to have written on your tombstone. But I think it's interesting, the story about his death is, the Duke of Tuscany, who's I think his nephew is the Pope, and he's like, I'm going to put Galileo in Santa Croce in the Basilica, where we bury the great people from Florence. And the Pope and the Cardinal say, no, you can't do that. But the fact that the Duke of Tuscany is even considering it just goes to show that I don't think a lot of people agreed with what the church were doing. And they just kind of, hey, we have to toe the line, and ultimately they're going to make those decisions. And like you said, eventually the church comes around and they move him back there, and you can still see his tomb today. And so again, I think it goes to show, and something that we do a lot here is like, how do we look at how people talked about that person or respected that person in their day? I think there's a million reasons to look back on Galileo and be like, oh my gosh, he started this and it led to this and this and this. We couldn't have got to the moon without Galileo, for example. But I think as you see the fact that he's under house arrest and he's still able to publish these things, he's got students and people wanting to learn from him. And then, the Duke is wanting to bury him in one of the most prestigious places in his whole duchy. It just goes to show that people in the day understood who he was and his talent. That I think really goes a long way to show of just like how just monumental of a person he is in history.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way other than to quantify him as someone who, let me take that one step back. I think for me, the biggest takeaway from this episode and the research, I've always been fascinated by epistemology, which is the study of knowledge. How can we ever know something for certain? And the reality of that is from many things you can't unless it's observable, quantifiable, or measurable in some respect, and you can validate it and repeat it. For someone like Galileo to come along and challenge the very well understood and accepted belief of the time about the earth being the center of the universe and question that and be willing to put it on his back and argue for it, I think is an exceptional feat. And for me, probably makes him, one of the more powerhouse historical figures that we've looked at so far.
Without question, right? Is when we look back on science, there's probably 50 to 100 people that, we've talked about a few of them that without them, we'd be, we wouldn't be doing this podcast over the internet. I can tell you that. He's definitely one of those people. And I think with him, just on the fact that he's not only just theorizing these things and thinking about these ideas and saying, hey, I'm going to challenge this. He's not only, and then he's doing the experiments, but he's not also just doing the experiments. He's actually building tools and apparatuses that other people will use eventually to improve upon and actually make science as a profession and as a craft grow a little bit more. And the fact that he's able to do kind of all three of those and be able to share his information, with the public, again, I think that's just another level to the, the powerhouses, like you mentioned, of history. Is he's got his hand in so many buckets, and it's the perfect kind of stepping stone and foundation level that you need for science to really thrive and explode. And, he's not the first to do it. He's definitely born into a world that allows him to do it, but, he really puts the pedal to the metal and brings things forward at a rate that, only the special people in history can do.
Yep. Couldn't agree more.
Lovely. All right. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.